Live from Nasrec, you are watching continuing coverage of the G20 Leaders Summit here on Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405. I'm Simon Marks, Newzroom Africa's international correspondent here in Johannesburg for this big event. And over the next hour, we are going to be reviewing what day one of this International Leaders Summit has achieved. And it has achieved an awful lot in a very short space of time. Despite initial concerns about the United States boycott of this summit, South Africa has unquestionably so far held a very successful gathering. President Cyril Ramaphosa announcing overwhelming consensus for a leaders' declaration at the very beginning of today's activities.
South Africa has sought to ensure that the development priorities of the Global South and the African continent find expression firmly and permanently on the agenda of the G20. This is important not only for the people of Africa and the Global South. It is vital for global stability and security, alleviating resource pressures, managing population movements, and reducing the risk of conflict.
Now, of course, the words contained in that declaration absolutely matter. We're living through an era of fractured international politics, tremendous international geopolitical tensions, and it matters that these world leaders have come here together today to recommit to agendas based around President Ramaphosa's three pillars for this G20 Leaders Summit: solidarity, equality and sustainability. We've seen words contained in the final declaration that are designed to ensure debt sustainability for low-income countries, climate change, mobilizing finance for a just energy transition and inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and most important of all, reduced inequality.
Well, you know, for the first time, you have a G20 declaration that mentions Africa about 52 times or so. The president was doing a count on his iPad yesterday as he was being taken through the various elements of the document and also the process leading to the consensus that we've seen. Secondly, you have issues that are central to the development of our continent and the broader global south that have found strong expression in the declaration. For example, issues of debt sustainability, climate justice, issues of how we harness the value of our critical minerals. You have frameworks that have now been established between the African continent and the G20. And so for the first time, you have a significant expression of issues that are central to Africa's development, as well as a clear pathway of how these issues are to be approached and managed going forward.
Vincent Magwenya talking earlier today to my colleague Vuyo Mvoko. So we're going to have a conversation over the course of the next hour about just how much has been achieved today and what is likely to happen here at Nasrec tomorrow when day two of this Leaders Summit gets underway. And I'm joined by a terrific panel of international observers of the events of the last several hours. Immediately next to me is Antony Sguazzin, Bloomberg's Senior Africa correspondent. Sitting next to him, Larry Madowo, CNN International correspondent, and also with us Tim Cox, the Reuters Southern Africa chief correspondent and author of Lagos, a portrait of Africa's biggest metropolis. And Tim, I'd like to start with you, because before we came on air, you were saying to me, we just had a little chat beforehand, you were saying that in many ways this had been a more interesting day than you perhaps had anticipated.
Well, the assumption was always that it was going to be a total damp squib, that everyone would be kind of terrorized by Trump and by his absence here, and that they wouldn't be able to agree on anything because they'd be too many people would be not wanting to upset the Americans, or that even it wasn't clear whether you even could go ahead and do a declaration without them, and they were certainly seemed to be implying that you couldn't. And so for Cyril Ramaphosa to kind of grab the initiative like this and get everyone to agree on a statement, with the exception of Argentina, which was always going to be a tough call, given Milei's links to Trump and his similar ideological worldview. I mean, I don't think it could have gone any better than it did.
Larry Madowo, do you agree with Tim? And what were your thoughts about hearing that the White House had referred to this decision by President Ramaphosa to unveil that declaration on the first day, at the beginning? I mean, very unusual. I mean, normally we're all biting our nails at the end, right?
Yes.
So the White House has called that shameful on the part of President Ramaphosa.
The White House was always going to push back on this attempt to have a declaration, and they had telegraphed before this meeting that they would try to block any attempt at having a declaration. Usually, as you said, this happens at the end of the G20 Leaders Summit, so the second day tomorrow afternoon, but they made that decision over the days leading up to this to have it happen as the first order of business at the opening ceremony, which is also in itself a big testament. And they did go ahead and get this declaration across the line. Even though Argentina, President Ramaphosa said they were allowed to voice their objections as they did before, but he was important. I think he clearly said that this does not mean it's been nullified. It's still a declaration that exists. The White House calls it shameful, but they did it. And this declaration is a big document. It's 30 pages, 122 different elements of it. So getting this many leaders, 19 different representatives to agree on some kind of language, it's a triumph, however way you look at it.
Antony Sguazzin, there was interesting choreography at the beginning of today's event, because President Ramaphosa appears not to have told the cameras to be switched off and the microphones to be muted. And there was that moment when Ronald Lamola comes over and whispers in his ear and makes it clear that the cameras are still on. But President Ramaphosa continued with his remarks and announced that there had been overwhelming consensus for this declaration. Was that an accident, or do you think there was a bit of deliberate strategy in what was playing out there?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think it does work to his advantage. I mean, I'd reiterate what Tim and Larry have said. It's quite amazing that he's got this much support. And I think it is a testament to the fact that a lot of people, well, a lot of the representatives and countries in the G20 do think that they have to stand up and do something to defend multilateralism. Obviously, it's not the most well-attended G20. I think there are 6 or 7 leaders who haven't come, which is a record. But nevertheless, I've been through the declaration, and it seems to have all the elements that South Africa was looking for itself and for Africa. Debt sustainability, a lot on climate, even clean cooking has been included for the first time. So I think it's a triumph.
Now, there was, as we've noted, one holdout in all of this, and it came in the form of representations that Argentina made during that opening session earlier today. Pablo Cuerno Magrane is Argentina's foreign minister, and he indicated, unlike anyone else around the table, that the Argentinian government had reservations about some of the language contained in the declaration. Let's take a listen to what the Argentinian foreign minister had to say today.
We're deeply concerned with how certain geopolitical issues are framed in the document. Specifically, it addresses the long-standing Middle East conflict in a manner that fails to capture its full complexity. By focusing on a single dimension of a specific territory, it overlooks the broader regional context, the international recognition of different entities, and the structural causes of the dispute. In this regard, I wish to recall the recent adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2803 on November 17th, which emphasizes the international community's support for a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, while calling for a comprehensive, fair process to address all aspects of the conflict. In closing, Argentina, although cannot endorse the declaration based on the aforementioned discrepancies, remains fully committed to the spirit of cooperation that has defined the G20 since its inception. We're convinced that only through genuine dialogue, respect for consensus, and adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law.
So Argentina voicing opposition at least to part of the declaration. That, Tim Cox, President Ramaphosa said, has been overwhelmingly endorsed, an overwhelming consensus. I mean, we're in a new era here, aren't we, where consensus now has plural possible connotations.
Alternative definitions?
Alternative definitions. I mean, we'd heard about broad consensus, we'd heard about significant consensus, now we're told overwhelming consensus, but we don't precisely know what the definition of that is, do we?
Well, it's almost as if South Africa has kind of changed the rules about what a consensus means. That if we get enough people on board and we all agree on it, and if there's just one holdout, as there was in this case, that well, two really.
Was 2 out of 21, so.
Yeah, and you know, but they could. It was in a way it was easier to sort of you know, spirit away the first one, because it said, well, you didn't show up, so you can't have a voice in a forum at which you deliberately did not come to give your voice. But Argentina didn't do that, right? They did it a little bit because Malay didn't come, but still. They participated, and you know what Vincent Magwenya was saying, the president's spokesperson, is that they were participating right up until the very drafting of that declaration. So they were involved in, and he said the discussions got quite heated at times. And as they got closer to trying to get the declaration, and as the deadline moved closer, it got more and more heated. Argentina stayed through all of that. They dropped out the second it came to actually producing the declaration, which I think is kind of interesting. But I also note that his language is very guarded. That last sentence where he says that we couldn't endorse it, that's the subordinate clause. He says, although we couldn't endorse it, we still believe in the spirit of. So they're being very careful not to try and say that they're storming out like a sort of toddler throwing their toys out the pram. Right? They believe in the process. They just couldn't sign up for it. And the other thing I thought was interesting is they talk about the Middle East, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I mean I've read it, you know, a few times, but probably not with much depth. The Middle East conflict is only mentioned once, and they just say that we're going to work towards
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean,
work towards peace in occupied Palestine. Maybe it was the word occupied.
But one of the most interesting things about this declaration is it slams all the conflicts that it wants to draw on into one paragraph. I mean, DRC, Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, they're all sort of mentioned in just one paragraph. Previous G20 summits, Delhi in 2023, they were locked in negotiations over the wording specifically about the area of that declaration that was going to relate to Ukraine.
And the fact that they have them all in one paragraph is interesting, but to your point that we cannot endorse this overwhelming consensus, but we remain committed to the spirit of cooperation that has defined this G20 process, which I think I agree with you, it's hedging a little bit, and you're not walking out in the same way or not cooperating or participating in it. And I think that objection to the Middle East is to do with South Africa's position, which obviously, as we know, is in direct contravention to what the US wants. But and Argentina carrying the America's water in this argument is taking issue with basically one part of a comma?
Right, because Argentina is not an independent actor at this G20 summit, because Javier Milei and his midterm election results were basically financed by President Trump and the Americans.
And also, from our reporting, we do know that Argentina throughout the year has been emboldened by the US's stance and has been a drag on many of the discussions at a lower level. So I don't think it's a big surprise, but it wasn't a particularly strong objection.
But an objection nonetheless.
An objection nonetheless, yes.
Is any of you surprised that Ukraine has not played a bigger role today? We're at an inflection point here. President Trump, this 28-point peace plan, telling Zelensky he's got until Thursday to accept it, or the Americans are pulling the plug. It could so easily have come to overshadow the event, and instead the meetings have all been sort of bilateral and trilateral on the side.
Well, I think that might be the case in the declaration, but obviously, especially the European leaders at the summit have spent a lot of time today discussing the Ukrainian issue. They have issued a statement. I did notice the Canadian Prime Minister alone has issued no less than 2, perhaps 3 statements that specifically mentioned their solidarity with Ukraine, and it's implied criticism of the US's stance. So I think it's a big issue here. It just seems to be, to me, that the declaration has, with all the conflicts, has tried to minimize them and make them to a small part of the declaration so as not to derail the whole thing, because those are obviously the big contentious issues.
This has been a major issue for us on CNN. We've been covering this all day and paying attention to what the European leaders are saying. based on a Thursday deadline, President Trump has given Zelensky to accept this deal, which many analysts say gives Russia almost everything it's been asking for. And so we paid attention to the statement the European leaders, and to be clear, the Canadian leader and the Japanese leader, essentially saying, we agree this is a framework for a deal, but we have issues about the borders. Ukraine should not be forced to give up some territory, should not be forced to let go of some of its military, reduce the number in the military, and I think that is going to be a discussion you see a lot more. President Macron, a short while ago, still spoke a little bit about Ukraine in his press conference.
And just give me a sense of how big a story, or not, the G20 summit is in America. My sense of it is that there is no way Americans are getting as much coverage of this summit, certainly as, obviously, as everybody in South Africa is, but even as people in Europe are.
Certainly not, because President Trump is not here. And when President Trump travels, when any US president travels, there is an army of American media that comes with it. And you haven't seen that because he's not here. J.D. Vance, the vice president, was supposed to be here. That obviously got canceled. So the coverage in the US is a lot smaller. We are doing our job as CNN, which is we cover the world as well as we can. But suddenly, if President Trump had shown up, or J.D. Vance, it would have been a whole lot more.
Terrific. We've got lots more coming in our editors' roundtable. More from Antony Sguazzin, Tim Cox and Larry Madowo as our conversation continues. And when we come back, we're going to look at one particular section of this declaration that the leaders have agreed here and ask ourselves whether there is a very big news story perhaps buried within it. Stay with us on 405. Live at Nasrec, I'm Simon Marks with continuing coverage of the G20 Leaders Summit here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. And you are the most discerning viewers in South Africa. If you can hear all of the atmosphere behind us, of course, right now it's died down, but it'll kick off in just a second again. It's because the screens here at Nasrec have turned away from the various promotional videos that they show relating to the G20 Leaders Summit when there isn't much happening, and instead they're showing the Springboks game. But you, channel 405 viewer, are sticking with us, and we deeply appreciate it. We've got our editors roundtable underway. I'm joined here around the table by Antony Sguazzin, Bloomberg Senior Africa reporter, Larry Madowo of CNN International, correspondent there, of course, and Tim Cox, Reuters Southern Africa chief correspondent. And we're going to turn our attention now to one particular element of this leaders' declaration, and it's the last paragraph in the declaration, paragraph 122. We're going to put it up on the screen there for everybody to read. We thank South Africa for its leadership this year, say the G20 leaders. We commit to working together under the United States presidency in 2026 and meeting again in the United Kingdom in 2027 and the Republic of Korea in 2028. And then it says we welcome Saudi Arabia's ambition to advance its turn for hosting the G20 presidency in the next cycle. Tim Cox, they look forward to meeting again in the United Kingdom in 2027. There's no suggestion there that they're necessarily looking forward to meeting again in Florida in a year's time.
Florida's nice.
Well, clearly not, and I think they obviously were sort of setting it up so that, you know, if an awful lot of people get their visas denied, as seems quite possible given how, you know, vengeful that administration can be, that you know, it's a kind of hedging thing. And I don't, you know, I think they will go if they're invited, but I just think, I imagine that was the South African side saying, let's just be careful with our language here, just in case we have to do this by video link.
I mean, do you think that this is a bit of a needle, that they're sort of, they're needling Trump?
Well, that, it does fit, because there's been quite a few times where it's felt like that's what they're doing, right? And it's subtle enough that you can almost deny that that's what's going on. But yes, it's possible, isn't it? I mean, you know, it feels like it.
Antony?
I think so. I think it's been very carefully written. Maybe South Africa wouldn't want to go, maybe it won't be allowed to go, but definitely. I mean, I get the impression that most people are quite irritated, most countries, that so much of this summit has been dominated by the US not pitching up. And, you know, I have seen in the last few days, South Africa has, throughout this whole spat for the whole year, they've tried to keep everything on an even keel and not rise to the bait, but I have seen a little bit more bite in the comments in the last couple of days. I mean, when we had Ronald Lamola, the foreign minister, speaking earlier today, I think they were very clear that this idea that a deputy ambassador would accept the handover from the president of South Africa, it's quite insulting. So, you know, they were very clear that they were welcome to have some sort of events in Pretoria at the ministry's offices where a similarly individual of similar status would hand over sometime next week. I think they're very, you know, they've probably just had enough.
Larry, you correctly observed that Florida is a lovely place. I was there 10 days ago, and we've got a report that we're going to be airing tomorrow during our Day 2 coverage here at NASREC about how when the Americans claim that the G20 2026 summit is going to be held in Miami,
Right.
that's not entirely true.
Oh, do tell.
Because in fact, it's being held in Doral,
Oh.
which is the neighboring city.
Of course.
Right alongside Miami. I don't want to give away the full content of this report that we'll be presenting tomorrow, but it is being held at one of Donald Trump's personally owned properties. So he clearly wants this G20 summit to be held in America next year. The fact that the language in that final paragraph of the declaration is so carefully worded, that's got to be sending a message. It's a pressure point, isn't it?
You are assuming that President Trump will read the full 30 pages of this and get to the Article 122 and try and parse what this paragraph is saying and if it's supposed to be a dig at him. Maybe he will. Maybe somebody will summarize for him. I don't know for sure, but certainly I think the language in coming together with these things takes a lot of work, and people object to it, like Argentina, and they finally find a way to get them to all agree to it. And I think, yes, they were being very careful here, but I'm interested by the suggestion from these two gentlemen that maybe President Ramaphosa will not get a visa to go to the U.S. next year.
We were discussing this actually earlier on the channel today. I mean, if you go back to the UN General Assembly,
Yes.
there's a treaty that the United States has signed that governs the issuing of visas to heads of government, and yet the Trump administration was threatening not to allow Mahmoud Abbas to travel for the General Assembly this year.
Yeah, and I'm sure Ramaphosa can't have failed to notice that, and that probably has a lot to do with why the language is worded like. But I agree with you, and I think Antony had a point also that there's been a seismic shift in tone since that sort of very awkward meeting in the White House, in which, you know, to be fair, he didn't rise to the bait. He took it well, but he also kind of had to just sit there and take it because, you know, on the one hand, didn't want to be a Zelensky where you stand up to him and then. Right. But on the other hand, you know, there's that sort of schoolyard bully thing where it's like, well, if you just stand there and take it, that's not going to stop it. But you know, there was a lot of pressure from business, right? We are trading with America, please don't mess this up. And so he played it cool, right? But what did it ultimately achieve for South Africa, right? It hasn't actually helped them. You know, the same antics have been going on since. So I think then he saw that and thought, well, you know what? Now I'm going to stand up and you know, and be counted, basically.
Nothing to lose at that point.
Yeah, you're right, definitely. I mean, there's been talk of a trade deal between South Africa and the US being imminent now for 2 months. and it hasn't moved forward an inch as far as I can tell.
And I've heard from frustrations from people in the South African diplomatic circles who can't even get calls answered or emails returned by the U.S. Trade Representative or by people in the State Department. And so that is real, that this relationship is so deeply broken down that you can hear President Ramaphosa say, well, if he's not coming, that's his loss. We will move ahead. And I think that frustration is reflected in what you heard from the other leaders, from President Macron, from the Finnish president, from a lot of the other European leaders who showed up here who said, we have to recommit ourselves to multilateralism. We can't walk away from it. You either engage, show up and engage, or don't make suggestions about what you don't want to happen when you're not there.
Well, you've used the M word, the multilateralism word,
the big M word.
which is very good, because a major point on day one that is addressed in the declaration relates to the financing of development, and especially addresses the issue of debt for developing countries. Let's take a listen to what Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, of course, had to say about that earlier today.
We seek stability because it attracts investment. It improves planning and reduces the risk of global economic shocks. And we prioritize inclusive and vibrant markets because they are able to drive innovation and efficiency. Thriving economies lift people out of poverty. They encourage greater investment and trade, and they generate the revenue needed.
President Ramaphosa speaking earlier today. Antony, we know that the word Africa is used 52 times in this declaration. I haven't counted how many times the word inequality is used. But the fact is that this declaration and the language that it uses about debt, for example, is absolutely rooted in the concerns of this continent.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, and I think my colleagues here have said the same, there is a lot of what South Africa and therefore Africa wanted in this declaration. There's mentioned the debt issue, financing for climate problems, and all sorts of concerns that really affect developing nations, especially those in Africa. So I think, it's important. I think that they did well to get all of this in here. And I think if the US had been here, it would have been a far more difficult declaration to negotiate.
Tim, there's nothing new about the Global South saying that they want easier access to capital, that they want access to capital at lower interest rates,
Correct.
and they want an alleviation of this continent's astonishing debt burden. But are they going to get it resulting from anything that's happened here today?
It seems unlikely, doesn't it? Because usually when the donor countries step in, the interest they have in mind is that their own financial sectors, and this was always true in the 90s when people were calling for debt cancellation, a lot of which did actually happen. Of course, it's gone and got it all into debt all again. There was a huge sort of stiff resistance from particularly the banking sector, not wanting to take that haircut, but knowing that if they don't take the haircut, that what they're potentially facing is default. And so there's this kind of tension between the global north, which really does represent the interests of the financial sector that is effectively kind of exploiting these countries, and the global south countries saying, look, we're sick of this. And I think the only difference this time is that now China is amongst the big creditors. Before that was not the case. And so, and it was quite interesting to watch because, China is presenting itself always as an alternative actor to the West, right? We don't do things like the West does. We don't tell you what to do. We don't boss you around. We're just a partner. But when it came to the debt issue, they kind of behaved in a very similar way. Like, we want our money back, right? Or you roll the debt on, but we're not going to reduce it. And so, yeah, it's the same kind of context, but I think that the role that China is playing is the big difference, and I think that in some ways makes it even harder for them to get this kind of fairer terms of debt that they want.
Interesting. We will continue that conversation, and we're also going to look at some other areas of the declaration that may be immediately actionable and implementable, as our editors' roundtable here on Newzroom Africa Channel 405 continues. Welcome back to our G20 Summit Roundtable, live from Nasraq, and we're going to continue our conversation now about the outcome of day one of this G20 Leaders Summit. Of course, day two will dawn in just a few hours' time. Antony Sguazzin of Bloomberg, let me ask you about the proposals that were enshrined in the Stiglitz report that was submitted to this G20 for the creation of an intergovernmental panel to fight poverty and inequality. One of the authors of the report was sitting in one of those very chairs a little bit earlier this evening and telling our 405 audience that absolutely will now be acted upon, that there is nothing that can be done after this G20 summit to derail it. Right. What's your view on the creation of that intergovernmental panel and the likelihood of it actually achieving things once it gets cracking?
Well, I think the fact that it's going to be established is a big victory. Again, it's something South Africa wanted. They've pushed it forward. The report was produced pretty quickly. So I think that's a plus for South Africa. Now, it may not be possible to stop it if you oppose it, but I do think that next year it's not going to be a priority for the US as head of the G20, and I think that they will do their best to at least drag their feet on it. So let's see what happens, but I think, it won't necessarily be something that goes full steam ahead.
Larry?
And I bumped into them as they were leaving the set here, actually, the authors of the report, some of them, Winnie Byanyima, yes, who's the executive director of UNAIDS, and Professor Stiglitz, who was not here but was a lead author on that, and they were talking about how important this is. And I saw Oxfam put out a statement congratulating South Africa for overcoming geopolitical bullying to center inequality and poverty in a G20 meeting. This is the first time it's happened. But they also pointed out, and they said that it's a shame that rich countries and their allies watered down the language in this declaration. But they said it's still significant that for the first time, a G20 setting did put the billions of people before the billionaires, and the oligarchs have been put on notice. If it will continue, I agree. I don't think this will be a priority when the US takes over the G20 presidency, but it's a start.
And can we address that watering down? Because Winnie Byanyima told us that it had been a more muted vocabulary that was used in the report, description in the report, in the declaration.
That's how you get overwhelming consensus. You gotta change language, right?
But what did the language change actually mean?
Do you know?
I wasn't following the evolution of the language change. I mean, they wanted it. They would have wanted it to be as something that a government that's backed by billionaire oligarchs, which most governments are,
right,
aren't going to get upset about, and so it does have to be fairly bland. But in terms of the problem that they want to address, right? The figures in that report were very stark. I think it was something like, since the turn of the century, 50% of all GDP growth has gone to the top 1%.
Right.
It's like, so we're always being told, we need prosperity and we need to lift people out of poverty, and for that we need growth. But really, is that true if more than half of that growth is being monopolized, just making people who are already rich even richer? And so
the billionaires have got to become trillionaires.
Yeah, well, this is it, right? So the problem is, it involves, in order to correct this, which growth is clearly not going to do, it involves the billionaire class giving things up, okay? And they haven't shown any real will to do that so far. And they have very much bought off quite a lot of governments. I mean, I love the phrase state capture that South Africa coined to describe the Zuma years, because I think it applies much more broadly to governments all over the world. That these private corporate interests and oligarch interests often trump the interests of voters, because they can call the shots, and the voters can be divided over other things. So that's the issue. I guess the one thing, actually, just my last point, I think, is that as much as they don't want to give things up, they might start to think, well, at what point is this going to start being unsafe for me? Are we entering kind of an Octavia Butler novel where I'm sort of barricaded behind my electric fence, right, with the barbarian hordes trying to knock it in? So that might be something that convinces people that, okay, we need to have a more equal footing.
Definitely a pause for thought for them.
Yeah. I want to talk about some of the other pledges that have been made over the course of the last few hours here, because there have been billions of dollars in pledges that have been made from reallocations to climate, from SDR reallocations to climate financing and to the Global Fund. And let's take a listen to what German Chancellor Friedrich Merz announced here just a few hours ago.
Now, as you know, Germany supports this group. Germany currently supports economic reform projects in compact countries, and we are supporting that with more than 3.2 billion euros. This is a strong lever for new economic opportunities, both for Africa and for my country, for Germany. Today, and this is a great pleasure for me, I can announce a further important step of our engagement. Germany will become a shareholder of the African Trade and Investment Development Insurance through our development bank, which is called KfW, Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau. ATIDI is a powerful instrument, as you all know. It boosts trade. It boosts private investment in Africa. It reduces risks and builds trust for investors and for new investors. Our German equity investment in ATIDI will amount to more than 37 million euros now. This will have a big impact. We will be able to mobilize an additional at least 400, potentially 430 million euros or 500 million US dollars in trade and investment.
The German Chancellor there announcing investment that he says is going to lead to the creation of more private business opportunities throughout the African continent. How significant is that kind of a move in creating real business opportunity, real innovation, and at the end of the day, jobs for people who desperately need them in South Africa and beyond on this continent?
Well, I think it's been a theme of this conference. I mean, yesterday we saw Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, announce 7 billion euros in addition to, I think, about 8 billion that had already been pledged to renewable energy in Africa. And earlier in the day, she said that the European Union wants to be Africa's partner of choice. So I think there's a drive, there's a bit of a competition going on between the various great powers and perhaps some of the middle powers as well, to basically build influence in Africa, and I think the European Union is really stepping up its game. Of course, we'll have to see if these pledges actually translate into real money on the ground, but definitely there's been a change of tone and a big push this year. And, you know, we've had a EU-South Africa summit, I think it's an EU-Africa summit, if I'm not wrong.
Happening in Angola.
Happening in Angola.
New week.
So there's definitely, you know, there's a lot of activity, and I think that that's a lot of it is coming from the EU.
And competition is good, isn't it? Because
definitely
this this argument and this, I think, is honestly pointless debate whether Africa should be looking east or west. Is it China? Is it Europe? Is it, I don't know, Russia? It's pointless when you're trying to create jobs here. You're trying to give dignity to the people of Africa, many of whom still live in extreme poverty. And if anybody's putting money, whether it's Germany, whether it's the European Union, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, it's India, I think sign good deals and take the money.
How important was it, and this for any of you, that there was a fairly significant American business presence at the B20? They're not here at the G20, but private business, the American Chamber of Commerce, made a big point of being at that B20.
Well, I think that there are 600 companies, US companies in South Africa alone. I can't think they're enjoying the spat between the US and South Africa. It's not good for trade. It threatens their investments. They've sunk billions of dollars into bricks and mortar in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa. And it's not good for business. And, you know, they don't want to lose that. And they're here for the long term. Trump will be in power for the next 3 years, and perhaps they're looking beyond that.
So I know one big multinational, American multinational, that did have a presence at the B20, but they decided not to have the CEO here. only because they don't want that image of being seen to be supporting South Africa in this moment when they're uncertain about where they stand, and they don't want to be seen to be upsetting the White House.
Absolutely
Because they have a massive business operation in the United States.
Absolutely extraordinary. Tim,
So they have two legs, one in, one out.
Yeah. Tim, as I was saying at the beginning of the program, you've written this book, Lagos, a portrait of Africa's biggest metropolis. From the perspective of Lagos, how do you think this G20 is being viewed, particularly when it comes to the focus that we've been talking about on private financing, inequality, alleviation of debt?
Well, yeah, I mean, Lagos is a city of entrepreneurs with a huge amount of entrepreneurial energy, a huge amount of ingenuity and hard working. This is not a city where people just sort of sit under on a bench under a tree and chill out. No, everyone's a striver. They're constantly moving. So that sort of furious energy is there to create an economy. But there's clearly bottlenecks in finance. I mean, it doesn't even have anything like the kind of access to the kind of financial architecture that businesses in South Africa do, for instance. So I think there'd be a real nod to that. I think and especially with this idea of there being sovereign support from Western powers for insurance. I didn't totally follow this story, I have to admit, but you know, that is one of the things that is businesses have a problem, right? You need to have insurance because things won't always work out the way you want them to. And so, yeah, I think they'd be very for it, for sure.
Antony, no one today that I've heard has referenced the Death Star that might be out there hurtling towards the global economy in the form of an AI bubble that bursts. All of this conversation could very quickly be rendered, if not entirely moot, it could certainly be dramatically hampered were that kind of a market meltdown to begin in the United States and then reverberate all the way down here to South Africa.
Yes, you're right. So, I mean, there's been a lot of enthusiasm even about AI at this conference. We saw the UAE earlier today announce a $1 billion investment in AI in Africa. And there's not been much reference to the dangers that AI represents to the livelihoods of various people, or the fact that there's more and more talk about a potential bubble in the evaluations of these companies in the US. And that obviously would ripple through the global economy. So I think it's something that hasn't been discussed, but it's obviously an issue that's quite important.
And
I look forward to having AI version of me have this conversation with you next year in Florida while I'm home watching it.
How do we know this isn't an AI version of it?
How do we know, indeed?
But to be serious, we did have an AI transformation expert on Newzroom Afrika last night who was saying that one of the huge issues in South Africa and beyond in terms of the shift to AI is corruption within AI procurement.
Right.
Oh, okay.
What does the continent do to overcome that?
You mean we have not dealt with corruption in procurement, period, before you add an extra layer of complexity, and which means an extra layer of doubt in what's already an opaque process where we lose billions of dollars every year. So, fun times.
All right, well, I will continue my conversation with the real Larry Madowo, but also with my other guests, Antony Sguazzin of Bloomberg and Tim Cox of Reuters. We're going to talk in a moment about what happens tomorrow and also what happens beyond tomorrow. Stay with us. We're back here at Nasrec with our G20 Summit Roundtable. I'm Simon Marks, and I'm joined by Antony Sguazzin of Bloomberg, Larry Madowo of CNN International, and Tim Cox of Reuters at the end of day one of this G20 Leaders Summit, which means that tomorrow is day two. And there's one thing that we know is not going to happen tomorrow. At the end of this G20 summit, the gavel will not be passed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, certainly to President Trump. It won't be passed to Vice President Joe Biden, and it definitely won't be passed to the lower level chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Pretoria that the United States at the 11th hour and 59th minute demanded. Let's take a listen to what Ronald Lamola had to say about that, South Africa's foreign minister, of course, earlier today.
The issue of handover, the President of the Republic of South Africa will not be handing over to the charge d'affaires from the US. We will be handing over to the US in the DERCO offices or anywhere they may want us to arrange within the borders of the Republic of South Africa. We remain open, we are very cordial, and we are willing to cooperate to work with them.
Antony Sguazzin, I'm guessing you've been to the DERCO offices, perhaps? I've never been inside them. I'm guessing they're not quite as glamorous as this.
No, they're a standard South African government building in need of renovations, and you know, they haven't spent a lot of money on them.
So what do you make of this decision by the South African government? I mean, the Americans rode in literally at the 11th hour,
yes,
and said, right, here's a list of 8 diplomats we want accreditation for. We're going to need security. We're going to need vehicles to be cleared. We want canine explosives experts. I mean, it was a big ask. And the South Africans, it appears, gave it a little bit of thought. I mean, or maybe they were pretending to give it a little bit of thought and then kicked it into the long grass. And now this demand that the chargé, or whoever it's going to be, comes to DERCO, presumably to receive the gavel and whatever other instruments are involved in the passing of the presidency. How do you rate the way in which government has handled this?
Look, I think it would have been a mistake for them to have let Mark Dillard, who's the deputy head of mission, accept the handover. It would be insulting for a president to deal with a diplomat, you know, one of the ambassadorials, not even the ambassador, but the deputy. So I think that would have given the US what it wanted. I think it was calculated to be an insult, and they've managed to dodge that. It may make the US quite angry, though. So what they also went on to say was that a person of similar standing to the American official would hand over the gavel. So I think that's you know, what they're aiming to do. They'll probably have a deputy director general or director general or something like that, and try and avoid what the Americans were trying to do, which is create a bit of a spectacle.
Let me say this in TikTok language. What South Africa is doing is matching America's energy. Aura for aura, they call it, band for band. So if you're going to be petty, we can be petty as well. So you don't have President Ramaphosa handing over to a junior official, as the foreign ministry here called it. So we'll find somebody of his stature, and they can basically be at the same level.
It was also notable, Tim, that Vincent Magwenya said today that South Africa was not going to waste time responding to, and I think one can say this absolutely objectively, these shameful comments that were made by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt about the South African president running his mouth. I mean, they've taken the high road here. They didn't need to do that.
No, I mean, it was, when someone told me, I actually initially thought, no, you've got to be joking. Surely they didn't actually say that. You sure it wasn't just someone on Twitter or something pretending to be them? And then I saw the video, I was like, okay, wow. But I think in a way that they did well not to rise to the bait, because it was so cack-handed, that language, right? And it's so obviously disrespectful to a head of state to use that phrase. That it just makes them look like they don't really understand diplomacy. And I think South Africa was wise enough to see that, yes, this is that they have not come out of this, you know, looking particularly good. And so we don't need to make a big issue out of it. basically.
I want to look at another issue, which is what happens beyond this G20 summit. And I want to do it through the prism of a picture that we can put up on the screen today, which is in many ways one of the most extraordinary images of the day today. It's been put out by the German Chancellor's office, and it shows Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, Emmanuel Macron, the French President, and Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, locked in conversation about Ukraine. And we know that two of those men, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, are likely to find themselves in Washington within the next few days to try and talk President Trump down from his 28-point peace plan. But what interests me most is that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, may not be going. We know that the most important elements of G20 governance are contained within the Troika. The last country to host the G20, which will soon be South Africa, the next one that's going to be hosting it, America, and the one after that, Keir Starmer. And I wonder if you think that Keir Starmer and Cyril Ramaphosa, or whoever occupy their various positions by the time we get to 2027, but Keir Starmer and Cyril Ramaphosa are going to have to spend a lot of 2026 acting like a pincer movement against Donald Trump in an effort to keep the key pillars of this G20 summit, sustainability, solidarity and equality, at least alive, at least warmed up, so that the British government can then take it forward in 2027.
Yes, it's going to be a difficult task. And I think it will occupy a lot of their time. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, my understanding is, from our reporting, is that the US wants to really pare down the focus of the G20.
Back to basics.
Back to basics, back to big global finance issues.
Not G100.
Not G100, invite less people, and, you know, not waste a lot of time on what it thinks are irrelevancies like climate finance, climate change, sustainability, inequality.
Tim, do you think that Keir Starmer's keeping his powder dry? Because, I mean, I'm sure none of them really wants to get on an aeroplane and fly all the way to Washington again to have another conversation trying to soothe President Trump. But do you think there's a sense in which it's a strategic move by him to keep his channels of communication unsullied by disagreement over Ukraine?
Yeah, well, that's often how Britain approaches these things. So when there's a disagreement with Europe, Britain's always kind of in the middle, but sort of trying to show America that we're still friends. And so it wouldn't surprise me in the least that he was saying, I'm just not sure if I want to get involved in this argument right now. And maybe he'll be useful down the line if you know, as it evolves. But I think, as you say, while it's red hot, he's probably just thinking, you know, stay out of it.
There's a lot of domestic issues he's having to deal with. He's got a very contentious budget coming up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of both, really. It wouldn't be a good look for him to be away from home as well.
And he did sign on to this Ukraine allies statement after their meeting here in Joburg on the sidelines of the G20 today, which called President Trump's 28-point plan that said that it needs some additional work.
Yes.
It's the start,
Yes,
but they're
but
concerned about the
additional
borders and the military. And they're part of the E3. They have been speaking, the three of them, about Ukraine. They spoke to President Zelensky yesterday, and they still have a lot of work to do.
Additional work, the new version of overwhelming consensus. Lightning round to end. It's a yes or no question. Are we all going to be sitting in Florida in 1 year from now? Tim Cox.
Yes.
Larry Madowo.
Depends on if we're allowed in.
Anthony?
Yes.
A yes. Okay, a declarative. My thanks to all three of you. You've been absolutely brilliant. Antony Sguazzin, Bloomberg Senior Africa reporter, Larry Madowo, of course, of CNN International, and Tim Cox, Reuters Southern Africa, chief correspondent and author of Lagos, a portrait of Africa's biggest metropolis.